June 1942. 6 months earlier, the United States had witnessed something it had not experienced in generations: vulnerability. On the morning of attack on Pearl Harbor, smoke rose over Hawaii as battleships burned in the harbor. Steel twisted. Oil spread across the water in thick black sheets. Men were trapped below decks. Others dove into flaming seas just to escape suffocation. For Americans listening on radios across the country, the news did not feel real. The United States had always been protected by two vast oceans. War happened somewhere else, in Europe, in Asia, but never here. Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion in less than 2 hours. In the weeks that followed, the headlines grew worse. The Philippines were collapsing. Wake Island fell. Guam was taken. British strongholds in Asia were crumbling. The Japanese Empire was not just advancing, it was accelerating. And behind those victories was a weapon the world had underestimated: aircraft carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy had mastered a new kind of warfare. Instead of lining up battleships in traditional formations, they projected power through the air. Hundreds of miles away, unseen, they could launch waves of aircraft that struck with precision and disappeared before retaliation arrived. At the center of that doctrine were 4 fleet carriers: coordinated, disciplined, lethal. Akagi, aircraft carrier; Kaga, aircraft carrier; Soryu, aircraft carrier; Hiryu, aircraft carrier. These were not ordinary ships. They were floating airfields, each capable of launching devastating strikes. Together, they had formed the spearhead at Pearl Harbor. Together, they had humiliated the United States Navy. By early 1942, many in Tokyo believed America lacked the will for a prolonged war. The plan was simple: strike hard, expand fast, force negotiation before American industry could fully awaken. And so, a new operation was designed. It would lure out the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers, the last real threat in the Pacific, and destroy them in one decisive engagement. Once that was done, Japan would control the Central Pacific. The chosen bait was a tiny atoll most Americans had never heard of: Midway Atoll. On a map it was barely visible, a ring of coral surrounding a lagoon, isolated in the vastness of blue. There were no towering cities, no industrial centers, just airstrips, sand, and a small garrison. But geography does not care about size. Midway sat at a strategic crossroads. From there, long-range bombers could threaten Hawaii. Submarines could extend Japanese reach deeper into American defensive lines, and, perhaps most importantly, it could force the U.S. Navy into a fight it might not be ready to win. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed the Americans would rush to defend it. He was counting on it, because he believed that when they did, they would be crushed. Across the Pacific, American commanders understood the danger. The U.S. Navy had lost battleships at Pearl Harbor. Others were under repair. Carriers remained the only mobile striking force available, and there were not many of them. The margin between survival and disaster was thin. If America lost its remaining carriers in 1942, the Pacific could become a Japanese lake. Hawaii would be vulnerable. Supply lines to Australia threatened. The psychological impact alone could fracture national confidence. In living rooms across America, families followed war maps printed in newspapers. Tiny arrows showed Japanese expansion creeping outward like spreading ink. It felt relentless. It felt unstoppable. But what neither side knew yet was this: the coming battle would not begin with gunfire. It would begin with a whisper, a fragment of intercepted code, a suspicion in a basement office, and a decision that most people at the time would never hear about, because before ships would burn and aircraft would fall from the sky, before men would make the ultimate sacrifice, the fate of Midway would hinge on information. and that is where the story truly begins. While admirals studied maps and fleets crossed the Pacific, the most decisive battlefield in the war had no ocean, no sky, and no explosions. It was a basement. Beneath the humid air of Pearl Harbor, inside a cramped, poorly ventilated office filled with cigarette smoke, stacks of paper, and humming radio equipment, a small group of men fought a silent war. They were not pilots. They were not sailors. They would never fire a shot in anger, but they might decide who lived and who didn't. At the center of that effort was Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort did not look like the image of a wartime commander. He often worked in a red bathrobe and slippers. He slept on a cot near his desk. He ignored formalities. He ignored comfort. He ignored almost everything except the puzzle in front of him. Because for Rochefort, war was not chaos. It was a pattern waiting to be understood. The Japanese Navy communicated using a complex encryption system known as JN-25. It was not a simple substitution cipher. It was layered, numerical, constantly changing. Even partial breakthroughs required exhausting hours of cross-referencing intercepted fragments. Every day, American radio operators intercepted streams of coded Japanese transmissions, columns of numbers, seemingly meaningless, endless. To most people, they were noise. To Rochefort, they were clues. His team, known as Station Hypo, worked around the clock attempting to reconstruct meaning from fragments. They rarely had full messages. Instead, they worked with pieces, partial decrypts, statistical guesses, contextual inference. Progress was slow, frustrating, often uncertain. But by late May 1942, something began to stand out. One designation appeared repeatedly in Japanese traffic: AF. It was referenced in logistical planning, in fleet movement coordination, in strike preparation. AF was clearly important. The debate began immediately. Naval intelligence in Washington believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. The Japanese had shown interest in that region before. It was a logical guess. But Rochefort disagreed. He believed AF was Midway. The problem was not instinct. The problem was proof. If he was wrong, and the fleet was positioned incorrectly, the consequences would be catastrophic. American carriers could be ambushed. The Pacific Fleet could be crippled beyond recovery. Rochefort understood that his assessment would shape operational decisions at the highest level. He needed confirmation, and so he proposed something unconventional. Midway would transmit an unencrypted message openly stating that its water purification plant had broken down and that fresh water was running low. The idea was simple. If the Japanese intercepted that message and referenced water shortages in future coded transmissions about AF, then AF had to be Midway. It was a calculated risk. The message was sent. Then came the waiting. In intelligence work, waiting can feel heavier than combat. There is no movement, no visible progress, only the weight of uncertainty. Then it happened. An intercepted Japanese message mentioned that AF is short of water. The room reportedly fell quiet, because in that moment, suspicion turned into certainty. The target was Midway. Rochefort had been right. It is difficult to overstate what that meant. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States would not be reacting blindly to Japanese movements. They would be waiting. They would know where the blow was coming. And that changes everything. War is often portrayed as a clash of steel and fire. But at its highest level, it is a contest of information. Who sees first? Who understands first? Who moves first? In that basement, surrounded by ashtrays and decoding charts, Rochefort and his team had done something extraordinary. They had stripped away the element of surprise, and surprise had been Japan's greatest weapon. Yet victory was far from guaranteed. Knowing the target did not create ships, it did not produce aircraft, it did not manufacture experienced pilots overnight. The United States was still outnumbered, still recovering, still vulnerable. The information Rochefort provided was not a shield, it was an opportunity, and opportunity in war is fleeting. Now the burden shifted upward, from the basement to the bridge of command, because someone would have to decide how to use that knowledge. Someone would have to gamble the last carriers America had left. And if that gamble failed, Midway would fall. Hawaii could be next, and the Pacific War might take a very different path. The whisper from the basement had reached the surface. Now came the decision. When the confirmation arrived that AF meant Midway, the burden of action shifted to one man. Chester W. Nimitz was not a dramatic figure. He was calm, measured, deliberate, the kind of leader who did not raise his voice because he did not need to. But in late May of 1942, he faced a decision that could define the entire Pacific War. He now knew where Japan intended to strike. What he did not have was superiority. Japan's plan was bold and complex. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto intended to split his forces, draw out the remaining American carriers, and annihilate them in one decisive engagement. The 4 fleet carriers that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor would form the core of the strike force once again. Akagi, aircraft carrier; Kaga, aircraft carrier; Soryu, aircraft carrier; Hiryu, aircraft carrier. These ships carried veteran air crews hardened by months of continuous combat. Their pilots had trained together for years. Their coordination was precise, their confidence unshaken. Against that force, Nimitz could assemble only 3 carriers: USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Hornet, CV-8, and the damaged USS Yorktown, CV-5. On paper, it did not look promising. Enterprise and Hornet were operational, but their air groups lacked the deep combat experience of their Japanese counterparts. Yorktown had just limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, where she had taken serious damage. Naval engineers estimated months of repairs would be required to restore her fully. Nimitz had days. He summoned shipyard supervisors and asked a direct question: how long to make her battle-capable? The original estimate was 90 days. He gave them 72 hours. It was not an order born from optimism. It was born from crews worked in shifts around the clock. Steel plates were cut and welded without pause. Electrical circuits were rerouted. Structural reinforcements were improvised. Entire sections of damaged plating were patched with temporary solutions meant to last just long enough. The goal was not perfection. The goal was readiness. When Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor, she still bore scars from Coral Sea. Paint was fresh in some places, raw steel exposed in others. She was not pristine, she was not fully restored, but she was operational, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Nimitz faced another critical choice: positioning. If he miscalculated the Japanese approach, his carriers could be discovered first and destroyed before launching a coordinated strike. Carriers were not battleships. They were powerful, but fragile. A few well-placed bombs could turn them into infernos. The entire Pacific balance of power rested on those decks. Nimitz decided to hide his carriers northeast of Midway, outside expected reconnaissance arcs. He would let the Japanese begin their attack on the island. He would wait for their air groups to launch. Then, when their decks were busy rearming and refueling aircraft, he would strike. It was a plan built on timing, and timing in war is unpredictable. Weather could interfere, reconnaissance could fail, pilots could miss targets, radio confusion could unravel coordination. There were too many variables, and yet there was no safer alternative. If he remained passive, Japan would seize Midway unopposed. If he attacked too early, he could lose everything. So Nimitz did something rare in war. He trusted intelligence, he trusted preparation, and he trusted that his commanders at sea would act decisively when the moment came. There is a particular kind of courage required at the highest level of command. It is not the courage of charging forward under fire. It is the courage of committing thousands of lives to a plan that might fail. If Midway ended in disaster, Nimitz would carry responsibility for the loss of America's last carriers. If it succeeded, the Pacific War might tilt in America's favor for the first time. As his carriers steamed silently into position, radio discipline strict, and lights darkened at night, the Pacific seemed deceptively calm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese strike force advanced confidently, unaware that its movements were no longer secret. Two fleets moved toward the same small atoll. One believed it held the advantage of surprise. The other knew exactly what was coming, and between them lay thousands of miles of open ocean and a decision that could reshape the 20th century. The gamble had been made. Now all that remained was contact. Dawn, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean looked almost peaceful. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, blue sky above, blue water below. There were no visible signs that one of the most decisive naval battles in history was about to begin. On the decks of American carriers, pilots climbed into their aircraft with little certainty about what awaited them. They did not know the exact location of the Japanese fleet. They only knew it was out there. Engines roared to life. One by one, aircraft rolled forward and lifted into the morning sky. Among those aviators was a squadron flying one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the American arsenal, the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber. Slow, underpowered, poorly armored. Against modern enemy fighters, it was dangerously exposed. Leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, CV-8, was John C. Waldron. Waldron was not reckless. He was not naive. He understood the situation clearly. Intelligence had indicated the enemy would be heavily defended. Coordination that morning was imperfect. Fighter escort would be limited, possibly absent. Still, Waldron pressed forward. He reportedly told his men that if only one aircraft survived to deliver its torpedo, the mission would be worth it. It was not a speech of false hope. It was a statement of duty. The squadron flew low over the water, scanning the horizon. Then they saw them. The Japanese carriers, massive silhouettes against the morning light. As Torpedo Squadron 8 approached, they had no fighter cover above them. Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighters descended almost immediately. What followed was brutal. The Devastators were too slow to outrun the Zeros, too lightly armed to defend themselves effectively, too exposed to withstand concentrated anti-aircraft fire. One by one, American aircraft were hit. Smoke trailed across the sky. Planes splashed into the ocean. Explosions ripped through fragile airframes. And still, the survivors pressed forward. They continued descending toward torpedo range, straight into a storm of steel. None of the torpedoes struck their targets. Within minutes, the squadron had been annihilated. 15 aircraft launched, 15 aircraft destroyed. 30 men flew into that attack. 29 would not return. Only one survived. George H. Gay, Jr. Gay's aircraft was shot down after he released his torpedo. He crashed into the sea and managed to inflate a life vest. Surrounded by debris, oil, and the vast emptiness of the Pacific, he found partial cover behind a floating seat cushion. From the water, he witnessed the Japanese fleet maneuvering nearby. He watched aircraft taking off and landing. He watched smoke rising from damaged planes. He believed at that moment that the battle had been lost. From his perspective, the attack had achieved nothing. No carriers were sinking, no explosions marked success, only the silence of fallen comrades. But war is rarely judged in real time. What Torpedo Squadron 8 had done, unknowingly, was disrupt the Japanese defensive pattern at a critical moment. Their low-altitude attack forced Japanese fighters to descend to sea level. It forced carrier decks to maneuver evasively. It forced commanders to focus downward. And while the Zeros were engaged at low altitude, while attention was fixed on torpedo bombers skimming the waves, high above the clouds, another group of American aircraft was approaching. They had been searching desperately. Fuel gauges were dropping. Time was slipping away. They did not yet know that below them, 30 men had already paid the price. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 did not destroy a single carrier, but it created an opening measured in minutes, an opening that would soon change the course of the war. From the ocean surface, George Gay floated alone, unaware that history was about to pivot above his head. He believed he was witnessing defeat. In reality, he was drifting at the center of one of the greatest turning points in modern history. Because sometimes victory is not born from success. Sometimes it is born from sacrifice. And within the next few minutes, the sky itself would ignite. High above the Pacific, a different drama was unfolding. American dive bombers were running low on fuel, searching the vast ocean. Some commanders considered turning back. If they failed to locate the Japanese fleet, they would not return. Then, a break. A lone destroyer racing across the water. Its movement drew the pilot's attention, and through scattered clouds they saw them. 4 massive Japanese carriers, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Akagi, aircraft carrier. Kaga, aircraft carrier. Soryu, aircraft carrier. Hiryu, aircraft carrier. Below them, Japanese crews were rearming planes for a second strike. Fuel lines stretched across decks. Bombs and torpedoes were exposed. It was the worst possible moment to be attacked. Dive bombers split into attack groups. Among them was Richard H. Best. At 10:22 a.m., planes began steep dives, near vertical, screaming toward the decks. Anti-aircraft fire erupted below. Pilots had to hold their nerve. Release too high or too low could be fatal. One bomb struck Kaga, penetrating the hangar. Secondary explosions ignited fueled aircraft. Soryu took a direct hit, flames tearing through its deck. Akagi, the flagship, was hit by a bomb that exploded amid armed planes. In minutes, 3 carriers burned uncontrollably. The transformation was staggering. Once symbols of dominance, the carriers were now infernos. Smoke rose thousands of feet, crews fought fires, but aviation fuel and munitions were unforgiving. Hiryu, slightly apart, survived and launched a counterstrike. Japanese dive bombers targeted the USS Yorktown CV-5. Bombs and torpedoes struck, Yorktown listed, smoke billowed. Yet she remained afloat, masking her numbers and buying time. American search planes found Hiryu. Dive bombers descended again. Fires erupted, uncontrollable. Hiryu was doomed. All 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were lost. Japan's elite naval aviation corps, built over years, vanished in a single day. From the ocean surface, George H. Gay, Jr. watched the smoke on the horizon. The battle he had thought lost had been transformed. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had opened the sky above him. Before 10:22 a.m., Japan controlled the Pacific. After 10:27 a.m., momentum shifted. 5 minutes had fractured an empire's advance. 5 minutes of courage, timing, and opportunity had changed history. The smoke rose and the fire burned, but the battle was over. From the surface of the Pacific, the remnants of the American fleet watched the horizon. The USS Yorktown, CV-5, battered and listing, had survived the day's attack, but not without cost. Sailors clung to lifeboats, faces blackened with smoke and ash, watching as the ship that had carried them through hell began to sink. Victory in war is rarely clean. On Midway Atoll, the garrison took stock of the aftermath. The Japanese had retreated, but they had taken lives. The island was scarred. Its defenders bore witness to the cost of courage. Far below the ocean's surface, the wrecks of enemy carriers began their slow descent into the deep. Time would cover them in rust, coral, and marine life, but for now they were silent reminders of the day that had changed the war. In Pearl Harbor and Washington, people tried to measure the significance, but it could not be quantified by numbers alone. It was measured in men, in sacrifice, in courage. The stories of Torpedo Squadron 8, of George Gay drifting alone in the ocean, of Dick Best diving into the heart of fire, of every pilot, sailor, and worker who had made impossible choices, they became the true legacy of Midway. And that legacy was simple. Sometimes the smallest decisions can turn the tide of history. The American flag, raised over rebuilt carriers, over Midway Atoll, and over the nation itself, symbolized more than victory. It symbolized resilience. It symbolized resolve. It symbolized a country unwilling to surrender, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Years later, the young pilots who survived returned home, changed men. They carried with them memories of friends who would never return, of the weight of choices made in seconds, of the reality that courage often means standing alone against impossible odds. History often remembers dates, names, and numbers, but true history lives in the human heart, in the fleeting moments when a man chooses to act, to risk everything, to hold the line, even when all seems lost. Midway was more than a battle. It was a crucible. It tested leadership, tested strategy, tested courage, tested humanity. It was 5 minutes of chaos, 5 minutes of heroism, 5 minutes that changed the course of a global war. And those 5 minutes were built on years of preparation, months of sacrifice, and decades of courage. Today, when the Pacific stretches endlessly into the horizon, it is easy to forget the cost hidden beneath the waves. But every shipwreck, every veteran, every story of bravery is a reminder that freedom is fragile, that victory is never certain, that the future is written not only by the powerful, but by those willing to face the impossible. Midway is history, but it is also a lesson that courage, foresight, and sacrifice, even in the darkest hours, can change everything. The men who fought and the men who fell are not forgotten. Their actions echo across the Pacific, across generations, across the pages of history. They remind us that even against overwhelming odds, one decision, one act of bravery, one moment of unwavering resolve can alter the destiny of nations. And in the endless blue horizon, the story of Midway remains timeless, eternal, and profoundly human.